Uma's hands tremble as she watches the human cargo unload. Propaganda floods her mind. Brutal, violent, dangerous. But as the first prisoner emerges, she sees only a man, tired, dirty, yet somehow dignified. The year is 2157. Earth has fallen to the Vidian Empire. Humanity, once proud explorers of the cosmos, now toil as slaves across the solar system. On the red plains of Mars, a mining colony churns out resources for the conquerors. It's here that Uma, a young Vidian female, finds herself thrust into the role of caretaker for a group of human laborers. "Remember, they're animals," Zorn, her supervisor, hisses. "One wrong move and they'll tear you apart." Uma nods, antenna quivering with nervous energy. She's heard the stories, seen the footage of human strength and aggression. Yet as she observes the prisoners being processed, doubt creeps in. The decontamination chamber hisses. Naked humans stumble out, coughing and disoriented. Guards fit them with control collars, the devices locking with an ominous click. Among them stands Kyle James, former United Earth Defense Force soldier. His eyes, a startling blue against his grime-streaked face, lock onto Uma. She freezes. There's intelligence in that gaze, defiance even. It doesn't match the mindless brute she expected. Kyle straightens, shoulders squaring despite his chains. Uma finds herself mesmerized by the quiet strength he exudes. "Fascinated, are we?" Zorn's voice cuts through her reverie. "Don't get any ideas. Fraternization is strictly forbidden." Uma nods hastily, forcing her eyes away from Kyle. She clutches her datapad, steeling herself for the task ahead. Orientation. She must introduce these humans to their new reality, their quarters, work assignments, the rules that will govern their every waking moment. Taking a deep breath, Uma approaches the group. Her rehearsed speech dies on her lips as Kyle steps forward. His stance is challenging, body language screaming defiance, even without words. Uma fumbles with her translator, suddenly aware of how small she feels next to him. The device crackles to life, and Uma starts to speak. But as she looks up at Kyle, at the quiet dignity in his eyes, something shifts. The propaganda falls away. For the first time, she sees not a brutal creature, but a person, complex, resilient, and perhaps not so different from herself. In that moment, on a dusty Martian tarmac, the seeds of understanding are planted. Uma doesn't know it yet, but her world is about to change. The lines between captor and captive, Vidian and human, will blur. And in the harsh reality of the mining colony, an unlikely connection will form, one that could reshape the very foundations of their interstellar society. Uma steadied herself, pushing aside the unsettling feelings Kyle's gaze had stirred within her. She had a job to do, and she couldn't let herself be distracted by a human, no matter how intriguing he might be. "Follow me," she announced, her translator converting her words into the harsh sounds of human speech. "I will show you your living quarters and work assignments." The group of humans fell into line behind her, their chains clinking as they walked. Kyle positioned himself at the front, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Uma led them through the winding corridors of the Martian mining facility, her antenna twitching with each echo of their footsteps. "You will work in shifts," Uma explained, gesturing to a hollow display of the work schedule. "Rest periods are mandatory. Failure to comply with rest protocols will result in disciplinary action." "And what exactly does disciplinary action entail?" Kyle's voice cut through the air, sharp and challenging. Uma turned, startled by his boldness. "That is not your concern, human. You need only follow the rules." Kyle's face hardened, but he said nothing more. As they continued the tour, Uma found herself hyper-aware of his presence, noting how the other humans seemed to gravitate towards him, looking to him for cues on how to respond. The group descended into the mining tunnels, the air growing thick with red Martian dust. Uma's explanation of extraction techniques was interrupted by a low rumble that shook the walls around them. "What was that?" one of the humans asked, fear evident in his voice. Before Uma could respond, a deafening crack split the air. The tunnel ahead collapsed in a shower of rocks and debris, cutting off their exit. Panic erupted among the humans as dust filled the air, choking and blinding them. Uma's heart raced as she realized the gravity of the situation. The cave-in had damaged the security systems. The humans' control collars flickered and went dark. She was alone, trapped with a group of unrestrained prisoners. To her surprise, it was Kyle who took charge. "Everyone, stay calm," he shouted, his voice carrying authority even without the aid of a translator. "We need to assess the damage and find a way out. Form teams of 2, search for any weak points in the debris." Uma watched in astonishment as the humans obeyed without question, organizing themselves efficiently. Kyle turned to her, his blue eyes piercing through the dusty haze. "You know this tunnel system better than we do," he said. "Are there any alternative routes we can use?" Uma hesitated, torn between her training and the urgent need for survival. There might be a maintenance shaft nearby," she admitted. Kyle nodded. "Show me." As they navigated the treacherous terrain, Uma found herself pressed close to Kyle, his hands steadying her when she stumbled over loose rocks. The physical contact sent an unexpected thrill through her body, a sensation she quickly tried to suppress. "Here," Uma pointed to a narrow opening partially hidden behind a support beam. "This should lead to the surface level." Kyle examined the shaft, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's tight, but we can make it work. We'll need to clear some of this debris first." Over the next few hours, Uma worked alongside the humans, her perception of them shifting with each passing moment. She marveled at their strength and resourcefulness, qualities she had been taught to fear rather than admire. Kyle, in particular, seemed to embody a spirit of resilience she had never encountered before. As they neared their escape, Kyle pulled Uma aside. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "for trusting us, for working with us. Maybe this is a chance for you to see that we're not so different after all." Before Uma could respond, the sound of approaching Vidian guards echoed through the shaft. The moment of connection shattered as reality reasserted itself. The guards swarmed in, reactivating the control collars and roughly separating the humans from Uma. Zorn appeared, his face contorted with rage. "What happened here? How did you allow these animals to take control?" Uma struggled to find words, her mind still reeling from the experience. "There was a cave-in. The systems malfunctioned." "Enough excuses," Zorn snapped. He turned to Kyle, who stood defiant despite the reactivated collar. You're being reassigned to Section 8. Let's see how long that spirit of yours lasts in the deep mines." As the humans were led away, Uma caught Kyle's eye one last time. In that brief moment, she saw not a slave or a savage, but a person, complex, brave, and undeniably human. It was a realization that would haunt her in the days to come. In the following weeks, Uma found herself drawn to the Section 8 mines, inventing reasons to inspect the work there. She watched Kyle from afar, noting how, even in the harshest conditions, he maintained his dignity and earned the respect of his fellow workers. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Uma made a decision that surprised even herself. Slipping past the guards, she approached Kyle's workstation and quietly left a package of extra rations. As she hurried away, her heart's pounding, Uma knew she had crossed a line. This small act of kindness was more than a gesture. It was the first step on a path that would challenge everything she had ever known about humans, about her people, and about herself. Uma's heart raced as she hurried away from Kyle's workstation, the weight of her secret act heavy in her chest. The extra rations she'd left behind felt like a lifeline thrown into dangerous waters. As days passed, her clandestine kindness evolved into a delicate dance of stolen moments and hushed conversations. She found herself manipulating work schedules, assigning herself to oversee Kyle's section with increasing frequency. Her antenna twitched nervously as she approached him, datapad clutched tightly to her chest. "I need to inspect the progress in this quadrant," Uma announced, her voice carrying the practiced authority of a Vidian overseer. But her eyes told a different story as they met Kyle's, a silent understanding passing between them. As she leaned in to examine his work, Kyle's voice dropped to a whisper. "Thank you for the rations. You're taking a big risk." Uma's antenna quivered. I just couldn't stand by and do nothing. Their conversations, though brief, opened Uma's eyes to a world she'd never truly seen. Kyle spoke of Earth, not as the savage planet of Vidian propaganda, but as a vibrant world of diverse cultures and breathtaking beauty. He described soaring mountains, vast oceans, and cities that glittered like stars at night. We were explorers once, Kyle said, his voice tinged with longing. We dreamed of peaceful contact with other civilizations. Instead, we got conquest. Uma absorbed his words, each one chipping away at the foundation of lies she'd been raised on. She found herself lingering longer than necessary, hungry for more knowledge, more understanding. One day, as Uma made her rounds, a commotion erupted near the ore processing plant. She rushed towards the sound, her heart's pounding. The scene that greeted her made her blood run cold. Zorn loomed over a fallen human worker, his face contorted with rage. "Useless scum," he snarled, bringing his foot down on the man's outstretched hand. The sickening crunch of bone was drowned out by the worker's agonized scream. Uma's body moved before her mind could catch up. "Stop!" she cried out, inserting herself between Zorn and the injured human. Zorn's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Out of my way, Uma! This animal failed to meet his quota. He needs to be taught a lesson." Uma stood her ground, antenna flat against her head in a display of tenacity. "He can't work if he's injured. It's inefficient." Zorn hesitated, then stepped back with a growl. "Fine, but if his numbers don't improve, it's on your head." As Zorn stalked away, Uma knelt beside the injured worker. His hand was a mangled mess, fingers bent at unnatural angles. She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as they made their way to a secluded corner of the facility. Uma's hands trembled as she applied a regenerative gel to the worker's shattered bones. She'd smuggled the medical supplies from the infirmary, each stolen item feeling like a silent rebellion against the system she'd once unquestioningly served. "Thank you," the worker whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and gratitude. Uma nodded, unable to trust her voice. As she finished treating his wounds, she caught sight of Kyle watching from a distance. The look in his eyes, a blend of admiration and something deeper, sent a shiver down her spine. Later that evening, Kyle approached Uma as she was completing her final rounds. He glanced around to ensure they were alone before speaking. "What you did today, it was brave," he said softly. Uma's antenna twitched nervously. "I couldn't just watch him suffer." Kyle took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. "Uma, I need to ask you something. Something that could put you at risk." She met his gaze, her heart's racing. "What is it?" "The conditions here, they're killing us. Slowly but surely. We need help. Real help. Not just extra rations, but better living quarters, proper medical care. Is there any way you could—" His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Uma's mind reeled. What he was asking went far beyond her small acts of kindness. It was outright defiance of Vidian law. I don't know if I can," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Kyle's hand brushed against hers, the contact sending a jolt through her body. "I understand. It's a lot to ask. But please think about it. You might be our only hope." As Kyle turned to leave, Uma found herself reaching out, grasping his arm. He looked back, surprise etched on his features. "I'll try," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I can't promise much, but I'll do what I can." The smile that lit up Kyle's face made Uma's heart skip a beat. In that moment, she realized how deep she'd fallen. This wasn't just about helping the humans anymore. It was about him, about them. As the days wore on, Uma found herself taking greater risks. She adjusted work rotations to give the most vulnerable workers less strenuous tasks. She misplaced supplies, ensuring they found their way to those who needed them most. And always, she sought out Kyle. Their moments together became precious, stolen fragments of time where they could simply be Uma and Kyle, not Vidian and human. A lingering touch here, a shared smile there. Each interaction charged with unspoken emotion. But even as Uma's bond with Kyle deepened, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Zorn's suspicious glances became more frequent, his questions more pointed. And then there was Krell, the ambitious young overseer, who seemed to materialize wherever Uma went. Uma felt the noose tightening, knew that discovery was only a matter of time. Yet she couldn't bring herself to stop. The humans, Kyle, had become too important to her. It was during one of her late-night inspections that Uma overheard the conversation that would change everything. Zorn's voice, low and menacing, drifted from a nearby chamber. The plan is in motion. We'll start with Section 8, a tragic mining accident. By the time we're done, half the human workforce will be phased out. Uma's blood turned to ice. Section 8, Kyle's section. She stumbled away from the door, her heart pounding. She had to warn them. Had to warn him. As she raced through the dimly lit corridors, Uma knew she was crossing a line from which there was no return. But the thought of Kyle, of all the humans she'd come to see as people, facing certain death, there was no choice to make. She found Kyle in the workers' quarters, his face lighting up at the sight of her. But as he took in her panicked expression, his smile faded. "Uma, what's wrong?" She grasped his hands, her words tumbling out in a frantic whisper. "Kyle, listen to me. You're all in danger. Zorn, he's planning to—" A harsh voice cut through the air, freezing the blood in Uma's veins. Well, what do we have here?" Uma turned slowly, her heart sinking as she met Zorn's cold, triumphant gaze. Behind him stood Krell, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. Uma's grip on Kyle's hands tightened. In that moment, she knew their fragile world was about to shatter. The question was, would they be strong enough to pick up the pieces? Pieces and forge a new future. Uma's mind raced, searching for a way out of this precarious situation. She released Kyle's hands and turned to face Zorn and Krell, her antenna flattening against her head in a mixture of fear and defiance. "Overseer Zorn," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I was conducting an unscheduled inspection of the workers' quarters. There have been reports of inefficiencies." Zorn's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking between Uma and Kyle. "Is that so? And what sort of inefficiencies require you to hold hands with a human slave?" Uma opened her mouth to respond, but Krell cut her off. "I've been observing caretaker Uma's behavior for some time now, Overseer. Her actions have been irregular." The tension in the room was palpable. Uma could feel Kyle's presence behind her, a silent pillar of support. She knew she had to act fast to protect him and the other humans. "Overseer, if I may speak with you privately," Uma said, taking a step towards Zorn. "There are matters of security I need to discuss." Zorn studied her for a long moment before nodding curtly. "Very well. Krell, ensure the human returns to his assigned area. Uma, with me." As they left the workers' quarters, Uma cast one last glance at Kyle. His eyes met hers, filled with concern and something deeper, a silent promise that this wasn't over. In the privacy of Zorn's office, Uma's mind worked furiously. She needed to buy time, to warn Kyle and the others about the impending danger. As Zorn settled behind his desk, she took a deep breath and began to spin a tale of suspected sabotage among the human workers, hinting at a larger conspiracy that required further investigation. "And that's why I've been conducting these unscheduled inspections," Uma concluded, her antenna twitching nervously. "I believe we need to approach this situation with caution and gather more information before taking any drastic action." Zorn leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Interesting, Uma. Very interesting. I'll need time to consider this information. In the meantime, continue your investigations, but report directly to me. Is that clear?" Uma nodded, relief washing over her. "Yes, Overseer. Thank you for your trust in this matter." As she left Zorn's office, Uma's mind was already racing with plans. She had bought some time, but she knew it wouldn't last long. She needed to warn Kyle and set things in motion. Over the next few days, Uma carefully manipulated work schedules and security protocols. She created a window of opportunity, a brief period where she could meet with Kyle in a secluded maintenance tunnel without arousing suspicion. When the moment finally arrived, Uma's heart pounded as she made her way through the winding corridors of the mining facility. She found Kyle waiting for her, his face a mixture of relief and anxiety. "Uma," he breathed, pulling her into a quick embrace. "I was worried. What happened with Zorn?" She quickly filled him in on her conversation with the overseer and the temporary reprieve she had secured. Then, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper, she revealed the true reason for their clandestine meeting. "Kyle, listen to me. Zorn is planning something terrible. I overheard him discussing a plot to eliminate a large portion of the human workforce, starting with Section 8. They're going to stage a mining accident." Kyle's face paled, his jaw clenching. "When?" "Soon. I don't have an exact date, but we don't have much time." Uma gripped his arms, her eyes searching his. "Kyle, I can't stand by and let this happen. I want to help." For a moment, Kyle was silent, studying her face intently. Then he nodded, a decision made. "Uma, there's something I need to tell you. There's a resistance movement among the humans, led by a man named Dax. We've been planning, preparing, but this changes everything." Uma's antenna quivered with a mix of fear and excitement. "Tell me what I can do." Over the next hour, Kyle outlined the basics of the resistance movement and their plans. Uma, in turn, offered her knowledge of Vidian security systems and protocols. Together, they began to formulate a strategy to counter Zorn's plot and potentially free the human workers. As their meeting drew to a close, Uma found herself standing close to Kyle, the air between them charged with unspoken emotion. "Kyle, I want you to know that I'm with you in this. Whatever happens." Kyle's hand came up to cup her face, his touch sending a shiver through her. "Uma, you're risking everything. Are you sure?" In response, Uma leaned in, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. It was a moment of connection, of two worlds colliding and boundaries dissolving. As they parted breathless and flushed, Kyle's eyes shone with grit. "We'll find a way through this, together." Uma nodded, her heart's racing. "I should go. We can't risk being seen together again. I'll gather what information I can and find a way to get it to you." As she turned to leave, Kyle caught her hand. "Uma, be careful. If anything happened to you—" She squeezed his hand, offering a small smile. "You too, Kyle. Stay safe." Uma slipped away, her mind whirling with plans and possibilities. As she rounded a corner, she nearly collided with Krell. The junior overseer's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Caretaker Uma," he said, his voice imbued with barely concealed hostility. "What brings you to this section of the facility?" Uma's antenna flattened against her head as she scrambled for a plausible explanation. She could only hope that Krell hadn't seen or heard anything to compromise their plans. The fate of Kyle, the resistance, and the entire human workforce now hung in a precarious balance. Balance. Uma's mind raced as she formulated a response to Krell's accusation. "I was inspecting the maintenance systems in this area," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "As you know, we've had issues with the life support systems recently." Krell's eyes narrowed, but before he could press further, an alarm blared through the facility. The sudden noise provided Uma with the distraction she needed. "We should report to our stations," she said quickly, brushing past Krell. As Uma hurried away, her heart's pounding, she knew time was running out. She had to act fast to set their plans in motion. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the colony grew increasingly tense. Uma worked tirelessly, using her position to gather critical information about Vidian security protocols and patrol schedules. She passed this intelligence to Kyle during brief, clandestine meetings in hidden corners of the facility. Kyle and Dax intensified their preparations, conducting hushed training sessions with trusted human workers who would participate in the uprising. Uma watched from afar, her chest tight with a mixture of pride and fear for their safety. On the eve of the operation, Uma was making her final rounds when a hand gripped her arm, pulling her into a darkened alcove. She stiffened, ready to fight, but relaxed when she recognized Kyle's familiar scent. "We need to talk," he whispered urgently. "Something's happened." Kyle quickly explained the unexpected development. Krell had approached him, expressing a desire to defect and join the resistance. Uma's antenna twitched in surprise and suspicion. "Can we trust him?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Kyle's face was grim in the dim light. "I don't know, but Dax thinks his information could be valuable. We're meeting to discuss it now. Come on." They made their way to a hidden storage area where Dax and a small group of resistance leaders waited. The tension in the room was palpable as they debated the risks and potential benefits of accepting Krell's offer. After a heated discussion, they decided to cautiously accept Krell's help. Uma felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach, but she knew they couldn't afford to pass up the advantage of another Vidayan insider. As the day of the operation dawned, Uma found herself in the heart of the colony's control center with Krell. Her antenna quivered with nervous energy as she worked to disable the backup power source for the control collars. Across the facility, Kyle led a small team to sabotage the main communication array. Uma monitored their progress through the security feeds, her hearts racing with every close call. Suddenly, the screens flickered, and the communication array went dark. It was the signal they had been waiting for. Uma's fingers flew over the control panel, shutting down the backup power source. Throughout the colony, the oppressive hum of the control collars fell silent. For a moment, everything was still. Then chaos erupted. Human workers sprang into action, overwhelming surprised Vidian guards. Uma watched in awe as years of pent-up frustration and anger exploded into a coordinated assault. But their initial success was short-lived. An alarm blared through the facility, different from any Uma had heard before. On the security feeds, she saw a group of heavily armed and armored Vidian soldiers pouring out of a hidden barracks. "Shock troopers," Krell breathed, his face pale. "I had no idea they were here." Uma's heart sank as she watched the elite soldiers cut through the human resistance with brutal efficiency. She frantically searched the feeds for Kyle, finally spotting him rallying a group of fighters. She keyed the intercom, her voice ringing out through the facility. "Kyle, be careful! They're—" Her warning was cut short as the doors to the control center burst open. Vidayan loyalists poured in, weapons raised. Uma and Krell dove for cover as energy bolts sizzled past them. Using her knowledge of the facility's systems, Uma managed to seal off sections of the colony, impeding the shock troopers' movements. She prayed it would be enough to give Kyle and the others a fighting chance. As the battle raged, Uma found herself trapped in the control center with Krell, loyalist forces pounding on the sealed doors. She scanned the security feeds desperately, her hearts clenching as she saw Kyle's group surrounded and running low on ammunition. In that moment, Uma made a decision that would change everything. Her fingers flew over the controls as she initiated a localized atmospheric decompression in Kyle's section. Warning klaxons blared as both humans and Vidians scrambled for sealed areas. The gambit worked. The shock troopers were forced to retreat, giving Kyle's team a chance to regroup. As the dust settled, Uma realized the colony was now effectively divided. The humans controlled key resource and production areas, while the Vidayans held the administrative and military sections. Uma's antenna drooped with exhaustion as she slumped against the control panel. The uprising had succeeded, but at a terrible cost, and she knew this was only the beginning. A soft chime from the console drew her attention. A message flashed on the screen. "Meet at Rendezvous Point Alpha. Urgent." Uma's hearts quickened. She knew what she had to do next. With a nod to Krell, she rose to her feet, willpower etched on her features. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them alongside Kyle and the others. The fate of the Mars mining colony, and perhaps the future of human-Vidian relations, now rested in their hands. Hands. The message from Kyle burned in her mind as she turned to Krell. "We need to move," Uma said, her voice low and urgent. "There's a rendezvous point we must reach." Krell nodded, his eyes darting to the sealed doors. "The loyalists will break through soon. We need a diversion." Uma's antenna twitched as she considered their options. Her gaze fell on the environmental controls. "I have an idea." Working quickly, Uma manipulated the atmospheric regulators for the administrative section. As alarms blared, warning of a sudden pressure drop, she and Krell slipped out through a maintenance hatch. They navigated the chaos-filled corridors, dodging panicked Vidians and determined humans alike. Uma's hearts raced as they neared the rendezvous point, a storage area near the mineral processing plant. Kyle was there, his face smudged with grime and sweat. He pulled Uma into a quick embrace before turning to address the small group of human and Vidian rebels gathered around him. "We've won the first battle," Kyle said, his voice steady despite the weariness in his eyes. "But the war is a long way to go. We need to secure our position and prepare for the Vidian counterattack." Dax, a tall human with a shock of white hair, stepped forward. "I've got teams working on fortifying our positions in the resource areas. We're using mining equipment to create barriers and defensive positions." Kyle nodded approvingly. "Good. Uma, Krell, I need you to focus on the colony's environmental and life support systems. Make sure the Vidians can't use them against us." Uma and Krell exchanged a glance before Uma spoke. "We're on it. I'll also try to establish communication with other colonies. We might find allies, or at least gather intelligence on the Empire's response." As the group dispersed to their tasks, Kyle caught Uma's arm. "Be careful," he said softly. "We don't know who we can trust, even among the defectors." Uma's antenna drooped slightly as she nodded. "You too, Kyle. This is not nearly finished." Over the next few hours, the Resistance worked tirelessly to solidify their control. Uma and Krell delved deep into the colony's systems, implementing safeguards and fail-safes. They worked in tense silence, broken only by the occasional muffled explosion or distant shout. Suddenly, an alarm blared through the control room. Uma's antenna shot up in alarm as she scanned the security feeds. Her heart sank as she saw a group of heavily armed Vidians storming the communication array. "It's the shock troopers," Krell said, his voice tight with fear. "They're trying to regain control of communications." Uma keyed the comms. "Kyle, we have a problem. The shock troopers are attacking the comm array." Kyle's voice crackled over the speaker, punctuated by the sound of weapons fire. "I see them. We're mounting a counterattack now." Uma watched the feeds anxiously as Kyle led a team to repel the Vidian advance. The battle was fierce, with both sides taking heavy casualties. Her antenna quivered as she spotted Kyle engaged in hand-to-hand combat with a tall, imposing Vidian. "That's Captain Vrock," Krell whispered, his eyes wide. "He's one of the most ruthless commanders in the Empire." The fight between Kyle and Vrock was brutal, a clash of strength and skill. Uma's heart pounded as she watched Kyle narrowly dodge a vicious blow, only to retaliate with a swift strike of his own. As the battle raged, Uma's attention was drawn to a flashing alert on one of the monitors. She leaned in, her antenna twitching as she decoded the encrypted message. "No!" she breathed, her voice barely audible. "This can't be." Krell looked at her, concern etched on his features. "What is it?" Uma's face was grim as she turned to him. "A Vidian battlecruiser is on its way, and if Vrock can't suppress the uprising quickly, they're considering orbital bombardment." The implications of this news hit Uma like a physical blow. She knew they had to act fast. With trembling hands, she opened a channel to Kyle. "Kyle, we have a situation," she said, her voice urgent. "We need to meet with the Resistance leaders immediately." As she waited for Kyle's response, Uma's gaze returned to the security feeds. The battle for the comm array was still raging, but she could see the human defenders starting to falter under the relentless Vidian assault. Time was running out. The Resistance had won their first victory, but the real fight was just beginning. As Uma hurried to meet with Kyle and the others, she couldn't shake the feeling that their fledgling rebellion was about to face its greatest test yet. Uma's heart raced as she hurried to meet Kyle and the other Resistance leaders. The news of the approaching Vidian battlecruiser took a toll on her mind, each step echoing the urgency of their situation. She found Kyle and the others huddled in a makeshift war room, faces grim in the harsh light of flickering holo displays. As Uma entered, Kyle looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a mix of relief and concern. "What's the situation?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. Uma's antenna quivered as she relayed the intercepted message. "A Vidian battlecruiser is en route. If Vrock can't suppress us quickly, they're considering orbital bombardment." The room fell silent, the implications of her words sinking in. Dax was the first to speak, his white hair seeming to glow in the dim light. "We need a fallback plan, someplace they can't touch us from orbit." Kyle nodded, his mind already racing. "The Martian caverns. We can use our mining expertise to create an underground base." I can lead a team to start excavation immediately, Dax offered, already moving towards the door. Do it, Kyle agreed. He turned to Uma and Krell. We need to bolster our defenses against orbital attacks. Can you repurpose the colony's atmospheric shields? Uma's antenna twitched as she considered the challenge. It's possible, but it will take time and resources we may not have. Make it happen, Kyle said, his tone brooking no argument. It's our best shot at survival. As the group dispersed to their tasks, Kyle caught Uma's arm. We need to talk strategy. Walk with me. They moved through the corridors of the colony, now transformed into a war zone. The sounds of distant skirmishes echoed through the metal halls as Kyle outlined his plans. I'm organizing our fighters into specialized units, he explained. We'll establish a perimeter defense around vital areas and set up early warning systems. Uma nodded, her mind already working on the technical aspects. I'll coordinate with the teams to integrate our systems. As they walked, they passed groups of human workers, now turned resistance fighters. The perseverance in their eyes was palpable, a stark contrast to the fear and subservience of just days before. In the atmospheric control center, Uma and Krell worked tirelessly, their fingers flying over control panels as they reconfigured the colony's shields. The task was daunting, requiring them to repurpose systems never designed for this kind of defense. If we reroute power from the tertiary life support systems, we might be able to create a localized deflection field. Uma mused, her antenna twitching with concentration. Krell nodded, already making the necessary adjustments. It won't stop a full bombardment, but it could buy us time. As they worked, alarms blared throughout the colony. Captain Vrock had regrouped his shock troopers and launched a series of probing attacks on human-controlled sectors. Uma watched the security feeds with growing concern as Kyle coordinated the defense. His voice crackled over the comms, calm and authoritative, as he directed the human fighters. The skirmishes were intense but brief, each one testing the resistance's purpose and adaptability. Uma marveled at the ingenuity of the human defenders, watching as they used their intimate knowledge of the colony's layout to outmaneuver the Vidayan forces. In a rare moment of quiet, Uma found herself drawn to the communication array. On a hunch, she began scanning frequencies, searching for any signs of Allied activity beyond their isolated colony. To her surprise, a faint signal caught her attention. After some careful decryption, a face appeared on her screen, a human woman with steely eyes and an air of authority. "This is Senator Elena Reeves on Phobos," the woman said, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and caution. "We've heard rumors of your uprising. Are you in need of assistance?" Uma's antenna quivered with excitement as she replied, "Senator, this is Uma of the Mars Colony Resistance. We are in dire need of support." As Uma relayed their situation, Senator Reeves's expression grew grim. "We can't send overt military aid without risking Vidian retaliation, but we can arrange covert support. Stand by for further instructions." The communication ended, leaving Uma with a glimmer of hope. She immediately contacted Kyle, her voice urgent. "Kyle, I've made contact with a resistance group on Phobos. They're led by a Senator Elena Reeves and have offered to send covert aid." Kyle's reply was terse but appreciative. "Good work, Uma. Any help we can get could make the difference." As Uma turned back to her work, a new alert flashed across her screen. A small Vidian scout ship had entered Mars orbit, separate from the approaching battlecruiser. Its captain, identifying herself as Tala, was requesting permission to land and negotiate. Uma's hearts raced as she relayed this unexpected development to Kyle and the other resistance leaders. The debate that followed was heated, with valid concerns raised about the risks of allowing a Vidian diplomat to land. In the end, Kyle made the call. "We'll meet with this Tala, but under our terms, and with heavy security, it could be our chance to avoid further bloodshed." As preparations for the meeting began, Uma couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The arrival of this diplomat added a new layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. With the Vidayan battlecruiser drawing ever closer and Captain Vrock's forces regrouping, the resistance was walking a razor's edge. Uma's antenna twitched nervously as she monitored the colony's systems. Whatever came next, she knew they would face it together. The fate of the Mars colony, and perhaps the future of human-Vidian relations, now hung in the balance. balance, burdened immensely on Uma's mind as she raced through the corridors to meet with Kyle and the other resistance leaders. The news of the approaching Vidian battlecruiser had changed everything. She burst into the makeshift war room, her antenna quivering with urgency. Kyle looked up from a holographic display, his face etched with commitment. "We need a new plan," Uma said, her voice tight. "The battlecruiser changes everything." Kyle nodded grimly. "I've been thinking about that. We can't just sit here and wait for them to bombard us from orbit." Dax, his white hair gleaming under the harsh lights, leaned forward. "What if we take the fight to them?" A spark of an idea flashed in Kyle's eyes. "You're right. We need to strike first." He turned to the assembled group, his voice filled with willpower. "I have a plan. It's risky, but it might be our only chance." As Kyle outlined his daring strategy to launch a makeshift missile at the Vidian battlecruiser, the room erupted into a flurry of activity. Uma's mind raced, calculating the modifications needed to repurpose the mineral extraction equipment into a launch system. "It's possible," she said, her antenna twitching as she ran through the calculations. "But we'll need to recalibrate the targeting systems to account for the battlecruiser's shields." Kyle nodded. "You and Krell take point on that. Use everything you know about Vidian technology to give us the best shot." As the resistance mobilized, the colony transformed into a hive of frantic activity. Human workers, their faces set with dogged dedication, swarmed over the massive mining equipment, welding and rewiring under Kyle's direction. Uma and Krell huddled over a bank of computers, their fingers flying across the keyboards as they worked to modify the targeting algorithms. The air was thick with tension, broken only by the occasional shout or clang of metal. Suddenly, alarms blared throughout the facility. Uma's head snapped up, her antenna rigid with alarm. "Kyle, Vidian forces are approaching the main production facility." Kyle's voice crackled over the comm system. "Dax, take a team and hold them off. We need more time." Uma watched on the security feeds as Dax led a group of human defenders to meet the Vidian assault. The narrow corridors of the facility became a brutal battleground, with both sides using machinery and infrastructure as cover. As the conflict intensified, Uma's attention was drawn to a flashing alert on her screen. "Kyle, I'm picking up a transmission from the medical bay. It's Tala." The wounded Vidian diplomat's face appeared on the screen, her features strained but determined. "I have information that could help your attack succeed," she said, her voice weak but urgent. "The battlecruiser's shield systems have a vulnerability. If you target precisely, you could penetrate their defenses." Uma relayed the information to Kyle, her hearts racing with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Could they trust Tala's intel? Before they could fully process this new development, another alert sounded. Uma's antenna twitched in surprise as she decoded the incoming transmission. "Kyle, you're not going to believe this. Senator Elena Reeves from Phobos has just arrived with a team of operatives. They slipped past the Vidian blockade during the chaos." Kyle's face lit up with renewed hope. "That's the break we needed. Get them to the front lines with Dax. Their advanced weapons could turn the tide." As Uma coordinated the new arrivals, she saw Kyle's expression shift, a look of grim grit settling over his features. "Uma, I need to lead a diversionary attack. It's the only way to draw enough of Rock's forces away from the launch site." Uma's hearts clenched with fear. "Kyle, it's too dangerous. We need you here." "We need that missile launched more," Kyle replied, his voice softening as he met her gaze. "I trust you to coordinate from here. Keep me alive, okay?" As Kyle led his team out, Uma turned back to her screens, pushing down her fear and focusing on the task at hand. She watched as Kyle's diversionary attack initially succeeded, drawing away a significant portion of Rock's forces. But something wasn't right. Uma's antenna twitched as she noticed a pattern in the Vidian movements. "Kyle, be careful. I think Vrock is setting a trap." Her warning came just as Vrock's hidden forces sprang their ambush, catching Kyle's team in a pincer movement. Uma's hearts raced as she watched the humans fight desperately against overwhelming odds. In that moment of crisis, Uma made a decision that would change the course of the battle. Her fingers flew over the controls as she initiated a controlled decompression of specific modules, creating a chaotic environment that gave Kyle's team the advantage they needed. As the battle raged across the colony, Uma's attention was pulled in a dozen directions at once. She coordinated Senator Reeves's elite team, relayed Tala's intel to the missile launch crew, and kept a constant eye on Kyle's position. Suddenly, Dax's voice crackled over the comms, filled with urgency. "We can't hold the launch site. There are too many of them." Uma's mind raced, searching for a solution. Then Kyle's voice cut through the chaos. "The drills, we can use the excavation drills to tunnel under their position and launch from there." "It's our only shot," Uma agreed, already pulling up the schematics for the drilling equipment. "But someone needs to manually redirect them. The controls were damaged in the fighting." "I'm on my way," Kyle replied, his voice grim with grit. Uma hesitated for a split second, then made her decision. "I'm coming too. You'll need my expertise to recalibrate the launch systems." As she raced through the war-torn corridors of the colony, Uma's mind was focused on the task ahead. The fate of the entire resistance now rested on their ability to pull off this high-stakes endeavor. She found Kyle at the massive drilling machine, already working to realign its trajectory. Together, they worked in perfect synchronization, their movements a dance of precision and urgency, as Vidian weapons fire rained down around them. As the drill broke through to the surface, creating their improvised launch window, Uma and Kyle shared a brief, intense look. In that moment, volumes were spoken without a word. Then they turned as one to the jury-rigged missile launch controls. Uma's fingers flew over the targeting systems, incorporating Tala's intel about the battlecruiser's vulnerabilities. Kyle's hand hovered over the launch button, waiting for her signal. "Now!" Uma shouted, and Kyle hit the button. The missile streaked skyward, a bright flare against the Martian sky. Uma and Kyle watched its ascent with held breath, knowing that the next few moments would determine the fate of everything they had fought for. The missile's impact was visible even from the surface, a bright flash against the looming shape of the battlecruiser. But as the light faded, uncertainty remained. Had they struck a decisive blow, or merely provoked a devastating retaliation? As they waited for any sign of the attack's success, the sounds of battle raged around them. Vrok's remaining forces pressed their assault, and the loyalty of their Vidian allies remained uncertain. Uma turned to Kyle, her antenna quivering with a mixture of hope and fear. What now? Kyle's eyes remained fixed on the sky, searching for any sign of their victory or defeat. "Now," he said, his voice tight with tension. "We wait." "Prepare for whatever comes next," Kyle said, his eyes still fixed on the sky. Uma nodded, her antenna twitching with nervous energy. They didn't have to wait long for an answer. The missile's impact lit up the Martian sky, a brilliant flash that momentarily outshone the stars. Uma's eyes widened as she quickly analyzed the sensor data streaming to her handheld device. "Kyle, it worked!" she exclaimed, her voice trembling with excitement. "The missile hit their shield generators. Their defenses are down." Kyle's face broke into a grin, but before he could respond, the ground beneath them shuddered. The massive energy discharge from their improvised weapon had overloaded the colony's power systems. Lights flickered and died around them, plunging the launch facility into darkness. "We're trapped," Kyle said, his voice tight as he tried the door controls. Nothing happened. "The power's out." Uma's antenna drooped slightly, but her mind was already racing. "We can fix this. If we can access the auxiliary power systems, we might be able to restore power to this section and get out of here." As they worked to jury-rig a connection to the backup power source, the sounds of battle echoed through the colony. Uma's comm device crackled to life, Dax's voice cutting through the static. "Vrok's making a move on the environmental control hub," he reported, his words punctuated by the sound of weapons fire. "If he takes it, he could control the entire colony's air supply." Kyle's eyebrows furrowed as he worked on rewiring a control panel. "We need to get out of here and help them." Uma nodded, her fingers flying over her own set of controls. With a final connection, the lights in the launch facility flickered back to life. Kyle and Uma shared a quick look of triumph before racing out of the room. As they navigated the winding corridors of the colony, they encountered pockets of resistance fighters and freed colonists. Many were injured, caught in the crossfire of the ongoing battle. Uma's heart clenched at the sight, but she pushed on, knowing that securing the environmental control hub was crucial to their survival. They arrived at the makeshift command center to find it in chaos. Senator Elena Reeves was there, her face grim as she coordinated with her team of operatives. "The battlecruiser's been neutralized," she informed them as they entered. "We have agents on board creating havoc, but Vrock's forces on the ground are still a threat." Kyle nodded, quickly assessing the situation. "We need to get to the environmental control hub. Uma, can you guide us there?" Uma's antenna twitched as she called up a mental map of the colony. "There's a maintenance tunnel that leads directly there. It's narrow, but it should get us past most of Vrock's forces." As they made their way through the cramped tunnel, Uma's comm device buzzed again. It was Tala, the Vidian diplomat. "I've made contact with the battlecruiser's captain," Tala said, her voice weak but determined. "They're willing to consider a ceasefire, but we need to act fast before Vrock can rally his remaining troops." Kyle's face hardened with resolution as they emerged from the tunnel into the corridor leading to the environmental control hub. The sounds of intense fighting echoed from around the corner. "Uma, coordinate with Tala and Senator Reeves," Kyle said, checking his weapon. "See if you can get more of Vrock's troops to stand down. I'm going to help Dax secure the hub." Uma wanted to protest, to insist on going with him, but she knew her skills were needed elsewhere. She watched as Kyle disappeared around the corner, the sound of his voice joining the cacophony of battle. Turning her attention to her comm device, Uma began the delicate work of diplomacy and coordination. She relayed information between Tala, Senator Reeves, and the resistance fighters, all while monitoring the colony's fragile life support systems. As she worked, reports came in of Vidian soldiers laying down their arms, choosing to defect rather than continue fighting for a lost cause. It wasn't many, but every defection weakened Vrock's position. The battle for the environmental control hub raged on, the fate of the entire colony hanging in the balance. Uma's antenna quivered with tension as she listened to the updates, imagining Kyle in the thick of the fighting. Suddenly, a new transmission came through. It was Senator Reeves, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and caution. "The news of our uprising has spread," she said. "Other human settlements are beginning to rebel. The Vidians are losing control across the solar system." Uma's heart raced at the implications. Their small rebellion on Mars had ignited a spark of hope throughout human-controlled space. But before she could fully process this information, another call came through. "Uma!" It was Kyle's voice, strained and breathless. "We've got Vrock cornered in the hub, but he's threatening to shut down life support for the entire colony. We need your help." Uma's mind raced as she pulled up the schematics for the environmental control systems. She knew she had to act fast, but the consequences of a mistake could be catastrophic. With Vrock's finger on the proverbial trigger and the fate of the colony in her hands, Uma took a deep breath and began to work. The next few minutes would determine not just the outcome of their rebellion, but potentially the future of human-Vidian relations throughout the solar system. As Uma's fingers flew over the controls, she silently hoped that all their sacrifices would not be in vain. As Uma's fingers flew across the controls, bypassing Vrock's override attempts and rerouting critical systems, she heard Kyle's voice again through the comm. "It's done," he said, his voice filled with relief and exhaustion. "We've got Vrock. The hub is secure." Uma let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "The life support systems are stabilized," she reported. "We're safe for now." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Uma coordinated with repair teams, prioritizing critical systems and allocating resources across the damaged sectors of the colony. Kyle, working alongside Senator Reeves, organized the remaining resistance fighters to secure key areas and round up the surrendering Vidian forces. As the immediate crisis subsided, Uma found herself in the newly secured Central Administration Complex, surrounded by the leaders of their fledgling rebellion. Kyle stood at her side, his presence a comforting anchor amidst the chaos. Senator Reeves paced the room, her face etched with both triumph and concern. "We've won a significant victory here," she said, "but we need to move quickly to solidify our position." Tala, the moderate Vidian diplomat, nodded in agreement. "The Empire won't take this lying down. We need to establish a dialogue, Find a way to prevent further bloodshed. Uma's antenna twitched as she processed the incoming data streams. Reports are coming in from across the solar system, she announced. Other human settlements are rising up. We're not alone in this fight anymore. Kyle's expression hardened with drive. That's good news, but it also complicates things. We need to coordinate with these other rebellions, share resources and intelligence. As they debated their next moves, Uma's eyes were drawn to the viewport, where the massive Vidian battlecruiser loomed in orbit. An idea began to form in her mind. The battlecruiser, she said, interrupting the ongoing discussion. If we could secure it, it would give us a significant tactical advantage. Kyle's eyes lit up with understanding. Not just for defense, he added. It could be a symbol, a rallying point for the entire rebellion. Uma nodded, her antenna quivering with excitement. I know those systems inside and out. With the right team, we could take control without causing significant damage. As they began to hash out the details of the operation, Uma found herself working closely with Kyle, their minds in perfect sync as they anticipated and solved potential problems. The intensity of their shared experiences, the adrenaline of recent victory, and the uncertainty of their future created an electric tension between them. In a rare moment of quiet, as they pored over schematics of the battlecruiser in a secluded corner of the complex, Kyle's hand brushed against Uma's. She felt a jolt of electricity at the contact, her antenna curling slightly in response. Kyle's eyes met hers, and in that moment, the barriers between them crumbled. Their lips met in a passionate kiss, years of unspoken feelings, finally finding expression. When they finally parted, breathless, Uma's heart raced with a mixture of exhilaration and fear. We should probably focus on the mission, she said, her voice slightly shaky. Kyle nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You're right. But we're not done here. With renewed focus, they rejoined the others to finalize the boarding operation plans. Kyle would lead the assault team, comprised of their best fighters and some of the newly defected Vidian soldiers. Uma would coordinate from the colony's control center, guiding them through the ship's labyrinthine interior. As the team prepared to depart, Uma pulled Kyle aside. Be careful up there, she said, her antenna brushing lightly against his cheek. Kyle caught her hand, squeezing it gently. I've got the best navigator in the solar system watching my back. What could go wrong? Uma watched as the assault team boarded their transport, her heart's heavy with worry, but her mind sharp and focused on the task ahead. As the ship lifted off, she made her way to the control center, ready to guide Kyle and his team through whatever challenges lay ahead. The boarding operation began smoothly, with the assault team using Uma's intel to bypass the battlecruiser's outer defenses. But as they penetrated deeper into the ship, they encountered unexpected resistance. We've got loyalists entrenched in the engineering section. Kyle's voice crackled through the comm. Heavy resistance. We need an alternate route. Uma's fingers flew over the controls, pulling up detailed schematics of the ship. There's a maintenance shaft 2 levels down, she said. It'll be tight, but it should get you behind their lines. As she guided the team through the ship's winding corridors and access tunnels, Uma's attention was suddenly drawn to a flashing alert on one of her screens. A hidden transmission, heavily encrypted, was being beamed to the battlecruiser from deep space. Her heart raced as she worked to decrypt the message, knowing that every second counted. As the final layer of encryption fell away, the blood drained from her face. Kyle, she said, her voice urgent, we've got a problem. The Vidian High Command is assembling a fleet. They're coming to retake Mars and crush the rebellion. She heard Kyle's sharp intake of breath over the comm. How long do we have? Days at most, Uma replied, her mind already racing through potential strategies. Then we need to take this ship now, Kyle said, his voice filled with relentless drive. It's our only chance of defending the colony. Uma redoubled her efforts, guiding the team with even greater precision as they fought their way towards the bridge. The sounds of intense combat echoed through the comm channel, punctuated by Kyle's terse commands and the cries of the wounded. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Kyle's voice came through again. We're at the bridge, preparing to breach. Uma held her breath as she listened to the sounds of the final confrontation. The clash of weapons, shouts of anger and pain, and the heart-stopping whine of energy weapons filled her ears. Then, suddenly, silence. "Uma!" Kyle's voice was ragged but triumphant. "We did it! The ship is ours!" A cheer went up in the control center, but Uma knew their work was far from finished. As she began the process of integrating the battlecruiser's systems with the colony's defenses, she allowed herself a small smile of pride. They had won a significant victory, but the real battle was just beginning. With the Vidian fleet on its way and the fate of the entire solar system hanging in the balance, Uma knew that the decisions they made in the coming days would shape the future of human-Vidian relations for generations to come. As she worked, her thoughts drifted to Kyle, now safely in control of the battlecruiser's bridge. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And for now, that was enough. Enough. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Uma's moment of reflection was cut short by a series of urgent alerts flashing across her screens. She quickly scanned the incoming data, her antenna twitching with growing concern. "Kyle, we've got a situation," she said, her voice tense. "Long-range sensors are picking up a massive energy signature. It's the Vidian fleet, and they're headed straight for Mars." Kyle's response was immediate. "How long do we have?" "Days at most," Uma replied, her fingers flying over the controls as she ran calculations. "We need to mobilize every resource we have." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Kyle took charge of the military preparations, overseeing the transformation of the Mars colony into a fortified stronghold. Workers who had never held a weapon in their lives were now being trained to operate seized Vidian energy cannons and defensive systems. Uma worked tirelessly to integrate the captured battlecruiser's advanced technology with the colony's existing infrastructure. She pushed herself to the limit, often working through the night, fueled by a potent mix of caffeine and adrenaline. In the midst of the frantic preparations, Senator Reeves was busy on the diplomatic front. She reached out to her contacts across the solar system, forging alliances with other rebellious human settlements. Uma watched with admiration as the senator's efforts bore fruit, establishing a coalition of free human colonies with Mars at its center. Tala, the moderate Vidian diplomat, proved to be an invaluable asset during this time. She worked alongside Uma, using her knowledge of Vidian military protocols to decrypt enemy communications. "Uma, you need to see this," Tala said one evening, her voice tight with worry. She handed Uma a datapad containing a decrypted message. Uma's heart sank as she read the contents. "The fleet is being led by Grand Admiral Zex," she said, her antenna drooping slightly. "He's notorious for his brutal tactics against uprisings." Kyle's face hardened as he absorbed this new information. "Then we need to hit them before they reach Mars," he said, his eyes blazing with intensity. "A preemptive strike with our captured battlecruiser. It's risky, but it might be our only chance." Uma felt a knot of fear in her stomach at the thought of Kyle leading such a dangerous mission. But she knew he was right. They spent the next few hours planning the operation, poring over star charts and discussing tactics. As the time for Kyle's departure drew near, he pulled Uma aside. They stood in a quiet corner of the control center, their bodies close, voices low. "I'll come back," Kyle said, his hand gently caressing Uma's cheek. "I promise." Uma's antenna curled around Kyle's wrist, a gesture of affection unique to her species. "You better," she whispered, before pulling him into a passionate kiss. As Kyle's team prepared to depart in the captured battlecruiser, Uma returned to her post in the colony's control center. She watched on the main view screen as the ship lifted off, quickly becoming a tiny speck against the vast Martian sky. With Kyle gone, Uma threw herself into coordinating the planet-side defenses. She oversaw the deployment of a network of salvaged Vidian energy cannons around the colony, creating a formidable defensive perimeter. The human workers, now armed and ready, manned these weapons with unyielding commitment. Days passed with no word from Kyle's team. Uma tried to stay focused on her work, but her thoughts kept drifting to the dangers he faced. She was pulled from her worried reverie by an urgent transmission from the battlecruiser. "Uma, we've engaged the enemy fleet," Kyle's voice crackled through the comm system, punctuated by the sounds of intense combat. "We caught them off guard, but Zex is adapting quickly. We're taking heavy fire." Uma's hearts raced as she watched the battle unfold on her tactical displays. Kyle's ship had managed to destroy several enemy vessels, but now found itself surrounded and heavily damaged. "Kyle, you need to fall back," Uma urged, her antenna quivering with tension. "Retreat to Mars. We'll be ready for them here." As Kyle's damaged ship limped back towards Mars with the Vidian fleet in hot pursuit, Uma activated the colony's new defensive systems. The energy cannons roared to life, their beams lancing out into space to meet the approaching enemy. The battle that followed was unlike anything Uma had ever experienced. The sky above Mars lit up with the flash of energy weapons and explosions, visible even from the surface. Human fighters, hastily assembled and piloted by newly trained colonists, swarmed around the larger Vidian ships like angry insects. In the midst of the chaos, Uma spotted Kyle's battle cruiser on her screens. It was heavily damaged and pursued by several enemy vessels. Without thinking, she opened a direct channel to Kyle. "Kyle, listen to me," she said, her voice steady despite her racing hearts. "There's a canyon to your starboard side. It's narrow, but if you can navigate it, you might lose your pursuers." Uma held her breath as she watched Kyle's ship dive towards the Martian surface. Using her intimate knowledge of the landscape, she guided him through a series of treacherous turns and dips. The pursuing Vidian ships, unfamiliar with the terrain, couldn't match Kyle's maneuvers. One by one, they pulled up or crashed into the canyon walls. As Kyle's ship emerged from the canyon and rejoined the main battle, Uma allowed herself a moment of relief. But the fight was far from finished. The sky above Mars was filled with the flashes of weapons fire and explosions as the two sides clashed in a desperate struggle for survival. Uma's fingers flew over her control panel, coordinating the defense, relaying orders, and guiding their fighters. Every decision she made could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. As the battle raged on, Uma knew that the fate of not just Mars, but the entire human race in the solar system hung in the balance. Balance hung in the balance. Uma's eyes darted between the tactical displays, her heart's pounding as she watched Kyle's damaged battlecruiser emerge from the treacherous Martian canyons. "Kyle, status report," she demanded, her voice tight with concern. "We're barely holding together," Kyle's strained voice crackled through the comm. "But we're still in the fight." Uma's antenna twitched as she made a split-second decision. "I'm coming up there," she announced, already moving towards the exit. "What? Uma! No!" Kyle's protest was cut short as Uma severed the connection. She raced through the corridors of the control center, her mind already plotting the fastest route to the shuttle bay. As she ran, she barked orders into her communicator, coordinating the ongoing defense efforts. Within minutes, Uma found herself at the controls of a small, agile Vidian shuttle. Her hands flew over the unfamiliar controls, muscle memory from her years of training kicking in. The shuttle hummed to life, and Uma felt a surge of adrenaline as she guided it out of the bay and into the chaos of the battle above. The Martian sky was a maelstrom of energy beams and explosions. Uma's shuttle weaved through the debris, her expert piloting keeping her one step ahead of the Vidian weapons fire. As she approached Kyle's position, she saw the full extent of the damage to his ship. The battlecruiser's hull was scorched and pitted, with gaping holes in its armor. It limped through space, trailing debris and venting atmosphere. Uma's heart clenched at the sight, but she pushed aside her fear and focused on the task at hand. "Kyle, I'm here," she called over the comm. "What's your status?" "Uma?" Kyle's voice was a mixture of relief and concern. "We're in bad shape. The main reactor's barely holding, and we've lost most of our weapons." Uma's eyes narrowed as she scanned the battlefield. She spotted a cluster of Vidian ships converging on Kyle's position, led by a massive flagship. Her antenna twitched as she recognized the distinctive markings of Grand Admiral Zex's personal vessel. "Kyle, Zex is targeting you," she warned. "I'm going to draw their fire. Get ready to strike when I give the signal." Before Kyle could protest, Uma threw her shuttle into a series of dizzying maneuvers. She dove and spun, her small craft presenting a tantalizing target to the Vidian gunners. Energy beams lanced past her, missing by mere inches as she pushed the shuttle to its limits. Uma's distraction worked. The Vidian ships turned their attention to her, giving Kyle the opening he needed. His damaged battlecruiser surged forward, its remaining weapons blazing. 3 Vidian vessels erupted in flames before they could react. On the surface of Mars, Senator Reeves and Tala worked in perfect synchronization. They stood side by side in the colony's secondary command center, coordinating the ground defenses with Captain Vrock's invaluable intelligence. "Incoming dropships, Sector 7!" Tala called out, her eyes fixed on the tactical display. Reeves nodded, her voice steady as she relayed orders to the ground teams. "Resistance fighters, converge on Sector 7, use the ridgeline for cover, and hit them as they land." The human and defected Vidian defenders moved with practiced efficiency, their disparate fighting styles blending into a cohesive and lethal force. As the Vidian dropships touched down, they were met with a hail of fire from multiple angles. The landing zone became a graveyard of twisted metal and broken bodies. Back in space, Kyle and Uma found themselves fighting side by side, their ships moving in perfect harmony. Years of trust and shared experiences allowed them to anticipate each other's actions without a word. They wove through the Vidian fleet like dancers, their coordinated attacks leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Uma's shuttle darted in close to a Vidian cruiser, drawing its fire while Kyle's battlecruiser unleashed a barrage on its exposed flank. The cruiser's reactor went critical, the resulting explosion taking out 2 nearby frigates. As they pressed their attack, Uma noticed a change in the enemy's formation. "Kyle, look!" she called out. "They're falling back. We've got them on the run." Kyle's response was cut short by a violent explosion that rocked his ship. Uma watched in horror as the battlecruiser's engines sputtered and died, leaving it drifting helplessly in space. Without hesitation, Uma maneuvered her shuttle behind Kyle's ship. She activated the shuttle's tractor beam, straining its systems to the limit as she towed the massive battlecruiser out of the line of fire. "Uma, what are you doing?" Kyle's voice was filled with a mix of gratitude and concern. "Saving your life," Uma replied through gritted teeth, her hands white-knuckled on the controls as she fought to keep both ships stable. As they retreated to a safer position, Kyle's voice came over the comm again, this time with a note of dogged persistence. "Uma, I have an idea. It's risky, but it might be our only chance to end this." Uma listened as Kyle outlined his plan, her heart's racing at the audacity and danger of what he proposed. Using the damaged battlecruiser as a massive projectile against Zex's flagship was a high-stakes endeavor, but one that could turn the tide of the entire battle. "I'm with you," Uma said, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomachs. "Let's do this." Together they set to work, overriding safety protocols and repurposing systems for their daring plan. As they worked, Uma couldn't help but steal glances at Kyle through the view screen. His face was set in unwavering drive, his eyes blazing with the same fire that had first drawn her to him. With the final preparations complete, Kyle and Uma shared a long look. Words seemed inadequate in the face of what they were about to attempt. Instead, Uma pressed her hand against the screen, her antenna curling in a gesture of deep affection. Kyle mirrored the action, a sad smile on his face. "See you on the ground," he said softly. Uma nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They broke apart, each moving to their respective escape pods. As Uma sealed herself in, she took one last look at the battlecruiser that had been their home and weapon. In moments, it would become their final strike against the Vidian oppressors. With a deep breath, Uma activated the launch sequence. The pod rocketed away from the doomed ship, and she watched as Kyle's pod did the same. Behind them, the battlecruiser's engines flared to life one last time, propelling it towards Zex's flagship with devastating speed. The impact was spectacular. The battlecruiser tore through the flagship's defenses like paper, its momentum carrying it deep into the heart of the massive ship. For a moment, everything seemed to pause, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Then, with a flash brighter than any sun, Zex's flagship exploded. The shockwave rippled through space, catching friend and foe alike in its wake. Uma's pod tumbled end over end, alarms blaring as she fought to stabilize its descent towards the Martian surface. As the pod entered the atmosphere, Uma caught glimpses of the battle through the small viewport. The Vidian fleet, leaderless and in disarray, was already beginning to retreat, human and allied Vidian fighters gave chase, ensuring their withdrawal from Martian space. Uma's pod slammed into the red Martian soil, the impact jarring every bone in her body. As the dust settled, she could hear the sound of cheering in the distance. With shaking hands, she unstrapped herself and reached for the emergency release. The pod's door hissed open, and Uma stumbled out into the harsh Martian sunlight. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the brightness, and saw a familiar figure limping towards her from a nearby impact crater. "Kyle," she breathed, her heart soaring as she recognized him. They met halfway, collapsing into each other's arms as the sounds of victory echoed around them. As they held each other, Uma knew that their fight was just the beginning. The Vidians would return, and Mars would need to be ready. But for now, in this moment of triumph, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of their accomplishment. They had won the day against impossible odds. Mars was free, and a new chapter in human-Vidian relations was about to begin. Uma looked up at Kyle, saw the same mix of exhaustion and exhilaration in his eyes, and knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The cheers of the colonists grew louder as more people poured out of the settlement, rushing to greet their returning heroes. Uma and Kyle stood hand in hand, ready to lead their people into an uncertain but hopeful future.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.